Hello and welcome here. It's getting colder as we go into winter, so I made two hats. One of them is worn by Carrie when she played Anna Karenina in a 2012 adaptation of Lev Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. I have to admit I haven't watched the movie, but Keira Knightley is one of my favorite actresses, so that's how I found this inspiration. As for the other hat, it's worn by Anna-Sophia Robb when she played Carrie Bradshaw in the series called The Carrie Diaries in 2013 and 14. It is basically about Carrie Bradshaw's teenage years. It's pretty good. I like the costumes overall and the whole vibe of both of the seasons. Also the actors and actresses they chose to work with. I think it's really well put together. Now let's get into the part when I actually sew. I'm going to start with Carrie's hat. The pattern for this hat is easy, but it might be a bit more difficult to get the proportions right. I had to make two versions of it because I was not content with how the first version turned out, but I will show you both of them later so you can decide which version you prefer for yourself. The pattern consists of two rectangles and that's it. I couldn't find any fabric that is sequin and thick enough to make a winter hat out of it, so I am going to combine a sequin and a stretchy cotton layer. The trimming is as long or wide as my head circumference on that line where I want to put the edge of the hat when I'm wearing it. For me, it was 58 centimeters on the first version. The height of the trim was 6 centimeters. The bigger rectangle was 70 centimeters wide and 30 centimeters tall. I left 2 centimeters for the seam allowance everywhere. On the main pattern piece, the sequin lines are parallel to the straight grain of the gray layer, and on the trimming I turned them to form an angle of 90 degrees to the straight grain. I placed them right side facing the right side, so along the edges, and leave one side open so I can turn it inside out. It takes a bit of patience as the sequins are getting stuck on each other. I sew along the edges here from the inner side and I make the same with the trimming. I drew a line at 1 centimeter from the edge and ran a double thread of an unmatching color all around on that line to gather the fabric. I gather it just as tight that it should match the length of the trimming. Then I pin them together, wrong side to wrong side. I am going to sew along the edge of the trimming. After that, I will cover the edge of the main piece with the trimming, pin it in place and sew it on its right side by hand. But before doing that, I wanted to close the other end of the hat. I drew a line at 1 centimeter from the edge, but it might be better at half centimeter. I have to run a double thread along this line to gather the fabric, just the same as I did at the other end of the hat. But here I pull it as tight as the fabric allows. I don't want to risk tearing the thread, so when it's gathered really tight, I fasten it even more by wrapping the thread around the gathered area. I also try to lead the needle through this bunch a couple of times, but it's really hard to do. It would be easier with pliers. And then I finish the seam with some knots. The second version of this hat, as I told earlier, is done with different proportions. The main piece of the hat is wider, but shorter than the previous. I made it 90 centimeters wide and 25 centimeters tall. I also made the trimming wider, it's 61 centimeters, but kept the 6 centimeters length. For the fur hat, I purchased 3 second-hand items. All of them are faux fur. A quite nice grey scarf with satin lining, a black headband, and the black scarf. It's not as good quality as the other two, but the headband doesn't have enough fabric in it for a whole hat. So I started with the black fur items, as I wanted to experiment on it to make sure I won't mess up the grey fur, as that's the prettier fabric. I removed the velcro from the headband, also the elastic band from the inside. After that, the process was almost the same as with the grey one, so I will explain on that one. First of all, I advise you to watch the process completely before making your hat and not in the same time while you are watching the tutorial, because it will need troubleshooting at one point. I continued with the grey hat on the next day. The black hat turned out like this. It doesn't look that good as I wanted it to, as the fur has different length on the headband part and the top of the hat. It just looks like a mess. The grey scarf has an elastic band between the fur and the lining, so I have to whip the seam on both ends and pull out the elastic first. I pulled out the elastic band. It was sewed on the lining all along the whole length of the scarf. But I realized during the process that it has one more elastic sewed into it on the back of the fur. So I ripped the seams completely on both ends of the scarf so that I can turn it inside out. It was a bit tricky because the fur is thick and I needed to pull on the lining in a way that I don't pinch the fur in the same time, and also the elastic was pulling the fabric, so it took some time. I removed this other elastic band and turned the scarf back. Usually these kinds of hats are made of fox tails, and that is cylindrical, so it's kind of curvy. To achieve and imitate that shape from a flat faux fur, I needed to take in from the lining. Let's play a little. I don't know if you can tell the difference on which part of the scarf I took in from the lining and where I left it as it was. I know it can be difficult to tell from this angle, but it is not impossible. Let me help. Here on this side the fur is spreading in every direction, while on this side it has more depth, looks more collected. So yeah, this is the side where I already pinned. I measured 2 centimeters from the center of the lining and pinned it, so it adds up to 4 centimeters altogether. I finished the pinning at the whole length of the scarf and made the seam with my sewing machine. After that, I measured the length of the headband and cut it. The fur is shredding a lot after being cut, so I had fur everywhere on the floor. I will have to finish the raw edges of it later. I made a kind of ellipse shaped pattern for the top of the hat. I took the measurements while the headband part was on my head. The longer axis is the distance between the headband's upper edges on the front and the back of my head, and for the shorter axis I measured my head approximately in the middle of those points. I cut 3 stripes from the rest of the scarf to have a complete covering for the top of my head. It's crucial to pay attention to the direction of the fibers, because you need them to point in the same direction to have a homogeneous look. The next step was finishing the raw edges, then sewing these stripes together by hand and finally sewing the top on the headband. I fastened the top and the headband together with clips and hand sewed them together following the edge of the lining. And the outcome looks nothing like the fur hat of Anna Karenina. It looks more like this one that Barbara Streisand wears. This is not bad either, but definitely not what I am aiming for. However, if you are overly conscious about your head size because you feel it's too big, this hat style can help with that, as it makes your head look tiny in comparison. Alright, let's do something about it. I had to call my mom, as I had no idea what to do. The step where I took in from the lining to give some dimension to the fur was also her idea, but it was only this time that it became clear to me. She told me to take in from the lining only for the headband area and not the top pattern. So as a first step, I ripped the take-in seam of the lining on the top part. Now it is not that bulky and round, but a lot flatter. That's a good start. As the next step of the troubleshooting, we tried to analyze again Anna Karenina's head, and we came to a conclusion that the top pattern is not just simply flat, but also way smaller than the one I made. So I needed to rip the seam to separate the top from the headband, and then I needed to cut the top smaller. It should be just a tiny bit larger than my hand. That will be a lot of fabric to get rid of. I made the top pattern so big that it could even serve as a nice, enormous epaulette for a warrior costume, which is not on our plate now, so back to the head. Before cutting it, I assembled the whole hat with some pins so I can try it on. Here, the area that I'm covering with my hands is that bit of the fabric that has to go. I will sew the top and the headband together close to the edge, but I will still need some seam allowance. Also, after assembling them, the upper edge of the headband also has to be fastened to the top to create a smoother edge without a gap between the fabric layers. I continued the fabric cutting in a bowl, so later I can clean up the fur easier and faster. I cut the excess from the top and finished the edges by turning them inwards and going along with a simple blanket stitch. I also reinforced the seam connecting the stripes and then attached it back on the headband. Finally, the time has arrived to show off the finished hats. Please don't mind that the footage is vibrating, it's just my camera being indecisive on where to focus. This is the first version of Carrie's sequin hat. And this is the second version of it. As you can see, the first one has a more elongated shape, while the second is shorter and has more pleats as I had to gather more fabric. I find the second one more similar to Carrie's head, but the first one also looks fine. And this is the fur hat of Anna Karenina. I'm really satisfied with how it turned out. Although it doesn't look the same as hers, but let's be real, there's no way for a cheap second-hand faux fur to look like as a probably real fur movie prop hat. But it looks so good, I love it! This is it. 2 hats from 2 different fictional characters. Good luck for making these hats, I hope this tutorial will come in handy. Thanks for watching, bye bye!